Lessons for Aging. Tonight's talk is on the topic of aging and the lessons that the Buddha learned about aging from his awakening. There's a story in the canon about a conversation between a monk and a king. One day, the monk, then, Rathapala, was spending the afternoon meditating under a tree in the pleasure garden of King Kauravya. When the king learned of this, he went to Rathapala and asked him, "Why did you ordain?" He knew the monk's family. They were wealthy, the relatives were still alive, and Rathapala himself was healthy, so the king didn't understand why he would ordain. Rathapala told him there were 4 Dhamma summaries that he'd learned from the Buddha and that had inspired him to ordain. The first Dhamma summary was, "The world is swept away, it does not endure." The king asked him, "What does that mean?" So the monk asked him in return, "When you were young, were you strong?" The king said, "Yes, I was very strong. In fact, I knew no one else who was my equal in strength." Then the monk asked him, "How about now? Are you still strong?" The king said, "Oh no, I'm 80 years old. Sometimes I mean to put my foot in one place and it goes someplace else." So Rathapala said, "That's what it means. The world is swept away, it does not endure." This is a lesson in anicca or inconstancy. At the same time, it's a lesson in aging. The canon's treatment of aging focuses on 2 issues. One is the loss of physical beauty, and the other is the loss of physical strength. In both cases, it teaches how to compensate for these losses by developing mental beauty and mental strength. As Ajahn Lee once taught one of his students who was on her deathbed, physical strength has to deteriorate, but mental strength doesn't have to. It can continue to grow, even as the body is aging and approaching death. The canon's discussion of mental beauty is fairly brief. It focuses on 2 main qualities. The first type of mental beauty is virtue, which means restraining yourself from causing harm. You do that by observing the 5 precepts against killing, stealing, illicit sex, lying, and taking intoxicants. In each case, the precept is against intentionally doing any of these things. So the emphasis is on the state of the mind with which you observe these precepts. There's a passage in the canon saying that virtue makes you beautiful even when you're old. The Buddha also says that virtue is one of your most valuable possessions. Loss of virtue is more serious than losing your wealth, losing your health, or even losing your relatives. Now, there's a challenge in observing these precepts. On the one hand, the ideal virtues are said to be unspotted and untorn. In other words, you never break them, but at the same time they're practiced in a way that's conducive to concentration. This means that you're strict with yourself in holding consistently to the precepts, especially around the issue of lying, but you're not obsessed with little actions that might cause you to be worried about little details. Did I do this wrong? Did I do that wrong? As you come to know your intentions more clearly, you gain more and more confidence and control over them, and you can feel more at ease about observing the precepts because you can be sure that your intentions are always good. And because you get to know your intentions better as you practice concentration, this is the way concentration and virtue help each other along. The second quality that the Buddha describes as a form of mental beauty is actually a cluster of 3 things: composure, forbearance, and equanimity. The challenges in life don't grow easier as you get old. When Van Lyon was trying to get me to revive my French, he got me a lot of biographies of famous French people, and a lesson I learned from each of them is, as you get older, life gets harder. You would think that as you get older, people would be more understanding and kinder. But actually, that's the time when the vultures come in and swoop down on you. One of the most striking cases was in the biography of Louis XIII and Richelieu. Late in life, Louis took a lover, un amant, much to Richelieu's disapproval, so the lover started plotting against Richelieu and tried to kill him. Yet in spite of all that Richelieu had done to help Louis throughout his reign, Louis just stepped back and allowed the plot to go ahead. So Richelieu had to take matters into his own hands, even though he was very old and sick. Ultimately, he managed to get rid of the lover and had him sentenced to death, but the whole process almost killed him. And this was not just the case with Richelieu. It seemed as if, in every biography I got from then Lionel, the older you got, the worse life became. Mazarin, Clemenceau, everybody. This is a universal pattern that you have to accept and deal with skillfully. You may not have kings and their lovers plotting against you, but as you grow older, you do have to become more dependent on other people, and it's likely that they're not always going to do what you want. So you have to be careful to restrain your anger so as not to drive away the people who are trying to help you. This is the lesson of composure and forbearance. They're a kind of endurance, in which you have the ability to lash out in anger or to punish or hurt somebody, but you don't. As for equanimity, equanimity gives you the ability to draw strength from the principle of karma. There are some things coming in from the past that you simply have to accept so that you can focus your energies or attention where they can do the most good, in the present moment. Because this perspective comes from the Buddha's awakening, this is where the principles of mental beauty connect with conviction, which is the first factor in developing mental strength. The Buddha teaches 2 different lists of mental strengths. Each list has 5 factors. One consists of conviction, persistence, mindfulness, concentration, and discernment. The second list is conviction, shame, compunction, persistence, and discernment. Put the 2 lists together, and you have 7 factors: conviction, shame, compunction, persistence, mindfulness, concentration, discernment. The first 3 members of this last list, conviction, shame, and compunction, form a set in that they motivate you to focus on developing skillful actions. Conviction here means conviction in the Buddha's awakening, and particularly, what his awakening says about the importance of your actions. If you act on skillful intentions, the results will be good. If you act on unskillful intentions, the results will be bad. The Buddha also learned that the results of actions can be very complex in their working out, and often take a lot of time. Which means that you cannot give in to weakness when it seems as if your skillful intentions are not yielding results as quickly as you like. You have to be confident that the good results will come at some point, so you should always focus on what you can do that's skillful right now, even if it's simply focusing on your breath. There was once a woman who was a student of Ajahn Mahabua, who was diagnosed with an advanced stage of cancer, so she asked if she could come to his monastery to meditate for a couple of months to prepare for her death. He told her, "I can help you look after your mind, but I can't look after your body. You'll have to find either a doctor or a nurse to come along with you." She had a friend, a retired female doctor who was 80 years old, who was willing to come along to help look after her. They stayed at the monastery for 3 months, and Ajahn Mahabua gave them a Dhamma talk almost every night they were there. They recorded every talk. A few months after they returned to Bangkok, the first woman died. The old doctor suddenly found herself with a big pile of more than 80 Dhamma talk tapes. She wanted to transcribe them to make a book, but because she was old and her eyesight was bad, she felt daunted by the task. When she informed Ajahn Mahabua of her plans and her worries, he told her, "See how much goodness you can squeeze out of your body before you have to throw it away." This sentence gave her the strength to complete the project, and as a result, we now have 2 huge books of excellent Dhamma talks on the topics of aging, illness, and death. Some of them have been translated into English in the book Straight from the Heart. So the basic lesson is, as you get older, don't focus on what you can't do, focus on what you can still do that's good. I don't know if you've ever heard of the American concept of the bucket list. There's an idiom for dying, which is to kick the bucket. I've tried to find out where this expression comes from, and although there are a lot of theories, nobody really knows. At any rate, the idea of a bucket list is that you make a list of the things you want to do before you kick the bucket. For most people, their bucket list consists of places they want to go, foods they want to eat, famous paintings they want to see, that kind of thing. But for a Dhamma practitioner, your bucket list should be focused on the good things you want to accomplish before you die. This attitude is based on the conviction that the good that you do never goes to waste. Shame as a strength has to be explained. In English, there are 2 types of shame. One is the shame that's the opposite of pride, and the other is the opposite of shamelessness. When the Buddha talks of shame as a strength, he's talking about the second one. Now, shame is basically the desire to look good in the eyes of the people you respect. So here the Buddha is recommending that you try to look good in the eyes of the noble ones. Now remember, The noble ones, people who have gained at least the first level of awakening, will hold you to a high standard of behavior, but they do it out of compassion. There's a passage where the Buddha talks about various motivations for sticking with the path, and one of them is called taking the world as your governing principle. The way he explains this is that in the world there are people who can read minds, and if they were to read your mind when you're thinking of giving up, what would they think? In other words, you can ask yourself, if I were thinking these thoughts, what would Ajahn Chah think about it? What would Ajahn Moon think about it? Or how about Upasika Ki? What would she think about it? If you feel ashamed about that kind of thinking, then stop thinking it. This is how shame is a strength. It keeps you on the path. This connects with what the Buddha said is the most important external factor for your first taste of awakening, which is admirable friendship. In other words, finding admirable people to be friends with and trying to follow their advice and example. Healthy shame is wanting to look good in their eyes. The next strength is compunction. This is fear of the consequences of doing unskillful actions. In this context, there's the realization that if you waste your time by doing unskillful things, you're going to suffer later, so you're causing yourself suffering by not using your time well. As we'll discover later, when the Buddha talks about fear of death, most of the fears come from a sense of powerlessness in the face of death. But compunction is fear that comes from sensing your power. You realize that you do have power to make a difference, but you're afraid of not using it wisely. This connects with the most important internal factor for your first taste of awakening, which the Buddha calls appropriate attention, Ṭhānissaro Bhikkhu. You feel the imperative in abandoning unskillful actions and developing skillful ones. This leads directly to the next strength, which is persistence. Persistence here is not simply brute effort. Instead, it's the effort to generate the desire to do what is skillful and to abandon what's not. This means that the effort here is aimed primarily at your ways of motivating yourself to practice. One way would be through heedfulness. You realize that you can make a difference with your actions, so you really do want to do your best to act in a way that's skillful. You remind yourself, if I don't act skillfully, there's going to be trouble down the line, but if I do act skillfully, I can avoid that trouble. Another way of motivating yourself to act skillfully would be through compassion. Do you want to cause yourself suffering down the line? Do you want to cause other people suffering by doing them harm? If you have compassion for anyone, you say, no, I'm going to try to be harmless by developing as much skillfulness as I can. Now, this will take some energy. There's no way to relax into awakening. Sometimes it's said that the awakened state is peaceful, so straining yourself to get there would be counterproductive, but the Buddha and the Ajahns never said that. You're sitting here and your knees are hurting, your back is hurting, and you say, isn't there an easier way to get to awakening? Can't I just lie down on the raft to go across the river? The Buddha says, no. The images they use, both the Buddha and the Ajahns, to illustrate the way to awakening are of people who are developing skills, people who are struggling against hardships, or people who are going into battle. These images are meant to stir up your energy to practice in spite of the difficulties involved. The remaining strengths are related to meditation, which we're going to be discussing in the mornings. Right now, I'd like to talk about some examples of how to apply these strengths to deal with issues that come directly with aging. For example, as we get older, we might start getting discouraged about the things we cannot do. The future looks pretty bleak, so we could start dwelling in the past. These can lead to 3 mental preoccupations that can sap your strength, waste your time, and lead to an unfortunate future, both in this life and after death. Nostalgia, regret, and resentment. In the case of nostalgia, your strengths of conviction, shame, and compunction can help you see that this is not just an innocent pastime, because the mind tends to be pulled in the direction of the topics to which it frequently returns. Nostalgia is thinking about good things that happened in the past but are no longer here, and actually no longer there. Even if you went back to the same place where those good things happened, it wouldn't be the same. Even if you were to find the people with whom you did enjoyable things in the past, they wouldn't be the same people. Think about the story I told this afternoon about the monk and the nun who wanted to get married again, and it just didn't work out. Even if you could somehow regain your lost pleasures, you would lose them again and again and miss them again. Remember what Ajahn Fuang said about the pleasures you miss. If you get them again, you're going to lose them again, so why bother? As for regret, you have to realize that past karma cannot be undone by regret. There's a line of thought that we may have picked up from our upbringing, which is that if we show a lot of regret, then we'll be freed from punishment. You've seen dogs do this, right? They pee on your carpet and they know that they did wrong, so when you come home, they just lie on their back to show that they're really, really sorry so that you won't beat them. Sometimes people think like that too, but that's not the best way to deal with regrets for past bad actions. According to the Buddha, the best response is to acknowledge the mistake and then to resolve not to repeat it. I will not pee on the carpet ever again. Then you develop the Brahma Viharas, goodwill for yourself, goodwill for the people you harmed, and then goodwill for all beings. By having goodwill for yourself, you stop beating yourself up over your past mistakes. After all, when you beat yourself up, after a while you get tired of doing that and you say, well, maybe it wasn't so bad after all. Then you could easily be tempted to make the mistake again. So it's best to have goodwill for yourself, and then for the people you harmed, and then for everyone else. When goodwill gets established in the mind, it'll help prevent you from making that mistake again. As for protecting yourself from the results of past bad karma, the Buddha said that you can actually weaken the results of past bad karma by your state of mind in the present moment. The best things to do to improve your state of mind here and now are to develop the Brahma Viharas and to train your mind in concentration and discernment so that it's not easily overcome by pleasure or pain. Sometimes you hear people say, stay away from concentration, it's dangerous, it's very pleasant, and you might get attached or addicted to the pleasure. But if you really develop concentration as a skill, you find that it involves training the mind so that it's not overwhelmed by the pleasure of concentration. You've probably seen this happen. You're focusing on the breath, and the breath is really comfortable, so you drop the breath and focus just on the pleasure, and then you blur out. To stay concentrated, you have to foster and maintain the pleasure, but you can't be focused on the pleasure. To maintain the foundation for the pleasure, you have to stay focused on the breath. In this way, you can get into deeper states of concentration. The mind has experiences of pleasure and equanimity, but it's not overcome by them. As for pain, you're learning to stay focused on the body even though there is pain there, and then you learn how to analyze the pain, which is a topic we'll talk about tomorrow. If you have this ability to stay with pleasure and not be overcome by it, to stay with the pain and not be overcome by it, then when the results of past bad karma come, they don't overcome your mind, even when you're not in concentration. As for resentment, this is basically ill will toward the people who have wronged you. This counts as a mental hindrance, which is a topic that we'll cover in a few days. The Buddha's basic message on aging is that it's an early warning sign of problems that will get heavier as you grow older and approach death. Now, he does encourage a style of living in which you try to keep yourself as physically strong and healthy as possible. His examples would be doing a lot of walking, as a way of keeping up your strength, and eating a healthy diet, but you do these things with the understanding that inevitably the body will start getting weaker as it gets older no matter what you do. You may feel betrayed by the body and that you've done everything you can to delay aging. Americans are especially obsessed with this, but the body owes you nothing. After all, it didn't sign a contract with you. You just moved in and you seized possession of it without asking if it was willing to submit to your terms. So don't feel betrayed by it when it starts getting weak. I knew a Dhamma teacher in America who was very much involved in the pursuit of health for most of his life. He was one of the founders of IMS, the Insight Meditation Society in Massachusetts. In the early days, when they would have their 3-month retreats at IMS, they would end the retreat with humorous skits to lighten the mood of the retreatants. So in one of the skits, this particular teacher hops in a car and goes to Boston. He goes to see an acupuncturist, he goes to a masseur, he goes to have his colon cleaned out, he visits several other naturopathic doctors, and he's gone for the entire day. Now there was someone else on the retreat who was famous for the fact that she would walk very slowly during walking meditation. So in the skit, at the same time that the first teacher hops in the car, she starts walking across the room. When he comes back after many hours in Boston, she arrives at the other end of the room. Well, the first teacher, in his later years, suffered a stroke. He told me that, when the stroke first hit, his first thought was, I did all of this for my body and now it's betrayed me. That's an attitude you have to drop. Instead, you should focus on developing your mental beauty and strength, which was what he eventually was able to do. These qualities of virtue, composure, forbearance, and equanimity, conviction, shame, compunction, persistence, mindfulness, concentration, and discernment will carry you through whatever happens with the body and will continue to support you after you and the body part ways. The message here is that you don't have to just accept the suffering that comes with aging, and you don't accept the unskillful mental states that come as your strength and beauty fade. You can develop the inner strength and beauty that will minimize the suffering and prepare you for the bigger challenges that lie ahead. Mindfulness of breathing. Mind. This morning we'll focus on the third tetrad in the Buddha's instructions on mindfulness of breathing. This tetrad focuses on the mind, although as was the case with feelings, remember that you try to stay grounded in the breath as you observe and train the mind. One of the paradoxical aspects of meditation is that when you meditate, the mind is training the mind. It's both teacher and student, or if you see meditation as a sport, both the trainer and the athlete being trained. As teacher, it learns instructions from outside, but it has to oversee the actual training. As student, it has to follow the instructions. This means that, as you meditate, the mind has to learn how to read itself, to see what state it's in as you begin to meditate, and then to try to get itself to act in a way that brings it into a better state, to reflect on how well it's succeeding, and then to continue to make adjustments until it settles into a state that's just right. 2 points are relevant here. When we think of the mind training the mind, it's useful to think of the mind as a committee with different members playing different roles. These are the different senses of self you have inside that are in constant dialogue. In meditation, we're training 3 of these senses of self in particular. 1, the self who wants to enjoy the results of the practice and provides motivation. 2, the self who is developing the skills needed to bring those results about. And 3, the self who watches over the whole process to see how well the other selves are doing and to suggest improvements. That's the first point. The second point is that for the mind to bring itself into balance, it will need a variety of meditation techniques for dealing with specific problems. The Buddha didn't teach a one-size-fits-all vipassana or concentration technique. He emphasized breath meditation as his central technique, teaching it in more detail and more often than any other technique, but he would also teach it in conjunction with other techniques. As he said, if you try to stay with the breath but there's a fever in the body or the mind, switch to another theme that you find inspiring, one that allows the body and mind to calm down, and then return to the breath. Or in Ajahn Lee's terms, the breath is a home for the mind. The other themes are places where it goes foraging for whatever food it needs that the breath doesn't provide. So as you're practicing, reflect every now and then on the state of your mind. If it's not falling into the 3 ideal steps that this tetrad sets out for the mind, gladdened, concentrated, and released, then you might want to make some adjustments in your practice. Remember, you're meditating on the breath, not for the sake of the breath, but for the sake of the mind. Always keep the well-being of your mind as your top priority. The steps in the third tetrad are these. The first step is to breathe in and out sensitive to the state of the mind. The second step is to breathe in and out gladdening the mind. The third step is to breathe in and out concentrating the mind. And the fourth step is to breathe in and out releasing the mind. The first step is simply a matter of noticing what state of mind you're bringing to the meditation as you sit down, and watching it as you try to get it to stay with the breath, to see whether it's happy to stay with the breath, or if something is getting in the way. This sounds simple, but it's actually a central skill in the practice, the ability to step back from your own moods and to recognize whether they're skillful or not. If they're not, you have to be willing to change them. The Buddha said that his own practice got on the right path when he was able to step back from his thoughts and divide them into 2 sorts, skillful and unskillful. Instead of judging them as to whether he liked them or not, he decided to see where they came from and where they would lead. If they came from unskillful attitudes, the desire to fantasize about sensual pleasures, ill will, or harmfulness, he knew that they would lead to unskillful actions, and that would lead to long-term harm. So he had to be willing to bring those thoughts under control. If his thoughts were based on skillful attitudes, like renunciation, goodwill, and compassion, he let himself think them until he was ready for the mind to settle down to rest and concentration. As you've probably noticed, you won't succeed in stopping unskillful thoughts simply by telling them to stop. You first have to convince yourself that you don't secretly side with them. Instead, you'd be happy to have them stop. This is where the next step comes in, gladdening the mind. You actively try to make yourself take delight in abandoning unskillful thoughts and developing skillful thoughts in their place. If, when you try to stay with the breath, you notice that the mind is happy to stay there, then you can keep your focus on the steps of the first and second tetrads. If it's not happy with those steps, then you have to talk to the mind to get it in the right mood, what the Buddha calls verbal fabrication or directed thought and evaluation. You try to talk yourself into being happy that you're here mediating and that you've got this opportunity to watch your own body and mind, to gain freedom from your attachment to thoughts that you know are not good for you. Sometimes you can get the mind in the right mood simply by changing the way you breathe, to give both body and mind more energy. This is where you can tell yourself to emphasize the steps of breathing in a way that gives rise to refreshment and pleasure, and to stay with those steps as long as it takes for the right attitude toward the practice to permeate the mind. But sometimes you might have to abandon the breath for the time being and focus on some other topic that will energize the mind. A few examples include contemplating how inspired you are by the Buddha, Dhamma, or Sangha. Another example would be developing the sublime attitudes, unlimited goodwill, compassion, empathetic joy, or equanimity. When any of these contemplations succeeds in gladdening the mind, you can return to the breath. The third step in this tetrad is to breathe in and out, concentrating the mind. In this case, you're trying to get the mind steadier and more focused. Sometimes, when there's too much energy, you have to clamp down on it a little bit if the mind is getting too scattered. Here again, you first try to use the breath to get the mind more concentrated. If focusing on the whole body is too distracting, focus on one spot and make the breath there as satisfying as possible so that it feels really good to direct all your focus on that spot. If any pressure builds up, think of it radiating out from that spot in all directions. Don't follow it out. Just stay focused in your center. I've found that a spot in the middle of the head is good for this kind of practice. Then, when the mind feels more firmly established, you can think of letting the range of your awareness expand until it fills the whole body. Then your concentration will be firmly established in a larger frame of reference. Sometimes, though, to get the mind more concentrated, you have to talk to it so that it loses its interest in thinking about other things. This is where you can bring in an alternative topic of meditation that's more sobering, such as recollection of death. You don't know when death is going to happen, but you do know that when it does happen, you're going to have to be well prepared, because your mind could easily latch on to some vagrant craving. If you're not in control at that point, it's like handing your car keys over to any crazy person who comes running past you on the street. You have no idea where the crazy person is going to drive you. So you want to have some control over your mind. This kind of reflection can get you more solidly focused and can calm the mind down. Finally, the last step in this tetrad is to breathe in and out, releasing the mind. Now this can mean release on many levels. To begin with, you're releasing the mind from its fascination with sensuality, its fascination with sensual thoughts and plans, and from the hindrances in general, which, in addition to sensual desire, include ill will, sloth and drowsiness, restlessness and anxiety, and doubt. When you can drop that fascination, you can get into the first jhana. When you've been there for a while, you can bring back the step of being sensitive to the mind. Is there any disturbance in your concentration? Here, we're not talking about disturbances coming from outside. We're talking about disturbances in the concentration itself. In some cases, the disturbances are the beginnings of thoughts that would distract you. In a case like that, once you're established with a full body awareness of the breath, you can keep watch to see if any thoughts are beginning to form. Usually, they'll start as a little stirring in the breath energy, in an area where it's hard to detect whether it's a physical sensation or a mental sensation. It's a little bit of both. If you decide that it's a mental sensation, you tend to put a label on it, that it's a thought about such and such, and then you get into it and ride with it. So you've got to stop the process as quickly as you can. It's like being a spider on a web. The spider sits in one spot on the web, but because the strands of the web are all connected, it'll sense any disturbance anywhere in the web. As soon as there's a slight vibration in the web, it'll run over and deal with any insect that's gotten caught in the web, and then return to its spot. In the same way, if you sense a little disturbance anywhere in the breath energy in the body, you leave the center of your focus and go over to zap that little stirring to disperse it. Then you return to your spot. That's one kind of disturbance. Another kind of disturbance is in the actual state of concentration itself. For instance, when you're already in the first jhana, you're engaged in directed thought and evaluation. After a while, though, you reach a point where you realize you don't need to do that anymore. The breath is really good, feels fine. You don't have to keep thinking about adjusting the breath and spreading the breath. You can just be with the breath. Then you can drop the directed thought and evaluation, and yet still stay with the breath. In fact, you can settle into the breath even more firmly, with a strong sense of oneness. A similar process continues through the various levels of jhana. You release the mind from the rapture, you release it from the pleasure, release it from the need to breathe. Not that you force the breath to stop, simply that the breath energy in the body is so full and well connected that you don't feel any need to breathe. You can even release the mind from the need to focus on the body. You can have a sense of space or sense of awareness as your topics. Those are some of the ways you can release it, ultimately on the way to total release. It's in this way that you can use the mind to train the mind, to read its moods, to make it glad to be abandoning unskillful thoughts and developing skillful ones, to get it more concentrated, and to release it, step by step, from its various burdens. So even though in breath meditation we're focusing primarily on the breath, we can't help but learn about the mind, and learn how to train the mind at the same time. In fact, that's what the practice is all about. We're not here to get the breath, we're here to use the breath to get to the mind. When you can learn the skills of making the mind happy to be here, you're well on your way to getting the most out of the practice. Question: if the air doesn't enter by the mouth or by the nose, is there still a breath energy? In other words, does the breath energy mean to breathe inside the body? Answer: yes, there always is an energy in the body as long as you're alive. When the mind gets very concentrated in the fourth jhana, the in and out breathing will stop, but that doesn't mean that you don't have breath. The breath energy actually fills the body very intensely at that point. Question: concerning the breath when you meditate, how do you breathe in? Does it come in through the entire body, through all the pores, or through one spot, for example, as when it comes in through the bottom of the feet? Answer: actually, it comes in and out all the pores of the body all the time, but there are some times that you want to emphasize the energy in one spot of the body or another, say, when you want to deliver more energy to that spot. You focus on the spot and you visualize it opening up to make it easier for the energy to enter and leave. Question: I can't come to establish myself completely in the body or with the breath. I always have a little thought that presents itself. Each time I see it, I'm able to leave for a couple of seconds before coming back to the breath or the body. I'm present for all of this, but I can't arrive at meditating completely with a sensation of the breath or the body. What do? I don't have the impression that I'm agitated. In fact, my mind is calm. Answer: when you start meditating, there will be little thoughts nibbling away at the outside of your awareness, and one of the best ways of dealing with them is simply to ignore them. If they do come, think of them as a dog who's coming around begging for some food. If you give it some food, it'll come back again. If you don't give it any food, it'll come a few more times and whimper and whine, but after a while, it'll realize that you're not interested in it and it'll go away. Simply paying attention to the little thoughts is to feed them, so pay them no attention at all. At first, they may say outrageous things to get your attention, but if you're consistent in not feeding them, after a while they'll go away. Once I was teaching meditation at a university in America, and the room they gave us had a very loud clock. At the end of the first meditation session, all the students opened up their eyes and said, "That clock." So I told them, the clock didn't destroy your breath, right? It's just the fact that you paid attention to it. So allow the sound of the clock to go right through you. In the same way with your thoughts, just allow them to go past and don't get involved. Question: After a couple of days of meditation, it actually becomes harder for me. I get a lot of tension in my head, and my mind becomes heavier with too much striving. I guess I focus around my head. How can I dissipate this tension while meditating? Answer: there was a Zen monk named Hakuin who suffered from the same problem. His way of solving it was to imagine a large ball of butter on top of his head, and it was melting all the time, dripping down his body. So when you focus on the breath, think of the energy going down the body instead of coming up into the head. Another way of avoiding having too much energy or too much tension in the head is to focus your attention on the hands and the feet. Or you can think, of the breath coming in and out of your rear end, the coccyx. That way, you can counteract the sensation of having to pull the energy in through the nose when you breathe. Question: Ajahn, I did not understand how you were able to stop your migraines. I have the same sort of problem. Could you explain more in detail? Thank you. Answer: I found that when I had migraines that it was closely related to the rhythm of my breathing, and there was something of a vicious cycle. The pain in the migraine restricted the way I thought I could breathe, and then the more my breathing was restricted, the worse the pain got. Now, migraines can be a very strict master. In other words, if you find one way of breathing that helps to cure them today, it may not work tomorrow, so you have to explore. However, I found a couple of things that did work fairly consistently. One was to break that vicious cycle by breathing in as much as I could, expanding the belly in all directions as far as I could, and then breathing out as much as I could. If you can keep that up for a couple of minutes, even though it may be painful, it seems to break the vicious cycle. Another way is to release as much tension as you can in the lower part of the back. One of the basic principles that helps you, though, is realizing that if, when you breathe in, you tend to feel that the breath has to work its way around the pain that's already there, you restrict the breath and aggravate the headaches. To counteract that, you can think of the breath being there in the body prior to the pain. If you hold that perception in mind, it gives you more room to breathe. Those are a couple of tips. Question: Yesterday, when you were saying not to be obsessed with the details when observing the precepts, it made me question myself because I believe that is my case. I can sometimes exasperate the people around me. I have a hard time finding out what are mere details and what is the real heart of the matter. So what are the criteria that I can trust to use as a measuring stick? When I don't follow the precepts in detail, what can I do that would not have any consequences or at least minimize the consequences? Answer: the important part of the precepts is being sure about your intentions. The people who tend to be obsessed about the details also tend to be unsure about their intentions. This is one of the reasons why doing meditation will help with the precepts. It will help you see, maybe you did step on the ant, but you can be clear about the fact that you didn't intend to step on the ant. When you can be clear about your intentions, then the issues about the precepts become a lot easier. Question: when I'm not practicing or on retreat, it's challenging to abide by the fifth precept, not drinking alcohol or smoking, especially when I'm socializing or simply just want to relax and have some fun. Do you have any advice or suggestions? Answer: to begin with, smoking is not forbidden by the fifth precept. As for drinking, when you come home after work, instead of pouring yourself a glass to drink, lie down on the floor and relax all the muscles in your body, starting with the top of the head and going down to the feet. That's how you can relax without drinking. As for fun, there are many ways of amusing yourself that don't have to involve drinking. And as for socializing, this group has heard this point before, but I'll mention it again. Tell your friends that your doctor says that you can't drink. Don't tell them that your doctor is the Buddha. This is actually an old image that goes way back to the Pali Canon, that the Buddha was the best doctor of all, so you're not lying. Question: a fugitive is demanding protection with me. I have accepted to hide him in my house. The fugitive is a political opponent to the government. The regime is repressive and tyrannical. The police pound at my door and ask if I have the fugitive in my house, and I respond no. Is this a lie? Answer: that would be a lie, and the way around that situation would be to figure out some way to not give information about the fugitive to the police without, at the same time, lying. This sort of thing is going to be a challenge for each of us as we practice the precepts. My experience has been that the ways of not giving information will vary from culture to culture and language to language. It would be hard to tell you how to do it in France, but I could tell you how we might do it in American. Answer. Look the police in the eye, act indignant, and tell them that you are hiding nothing shameful in your house and that they're welcome to search to confirm that. This strategy, though, might not make sense in France. Following the precepts requires that you use your imagination and discernment. So when you find yourself suddenly waking up in the middle of the night and can't get to sleep and you don't know what to think about, come up with your own answer to this question. Question. How do you cultivate skillful mind states when the body is not well without using nostalgia? Answer. One of the easiest things is to develop thoughts of goodwill. May all beings be happy. To whatever extent you're able to stay focused on that thought, stay focused there. That gives energy to the mind. Question. A preoccupation that causes me to worry, what to do with all of the photos and albums of photos and everything that have piled up over the course of time. Nobody wants to take them. I'm in the process of detaching from everything that would encumber me in the last part of my life. Now is the time of aging, illness, death, and insight into death. I want to be as free from the past as much as I can. Answer. You can do one of two things with your photos. One is to burn them all. The other is to hide them away someplace, say in an attic or basement somewhere, with the thought that maybe someday somebody will come across them in 2 generations and will find them fascinating and valuable. But as for you, you can say, I've had enough of that. This is when you think about what Ajahn Mahabua had to say. Direct your thoughts to the goodness you can still squeeze out of your body in this last part of your life. When you think about death as being the end of everything, you feel like you have less and less time and opportunity to do good things. But when you think about death as being a transition to a new chapter, you can think about what would be a good transition and what would be a good way to start the next chapter. In other words, think about your next life and the best way to prepare for it. It's as when you travel. When I come to France, I think about what I may be doing in France so that I can prepare when I pack my bags. Preparing for the next lifetime is like sending a package in the mail to yourself ahead of time. Question. When rapture or intense joy can be felt, are they related to our true nature, to our Buddha nature within us, or is it just a play of the mind? Where Hinduism and Christianity see the intervention of divine grace, how does Buddhism interpret these states that are more or less ecstatic? Answer. Buddhism interprets these emotions as the result of your actions, either your past actions or your present actions right now. What appears to be grace is actually the result of your past actions or of present actions that you may not be aware that you're doing. Question. How do we know what kind of being we were in our previous lives and what levels we were in? Can the first rebirth be something other than a living being, for example, something like a rock? Answer. You don't really need to know what kind of being you were in a past lifetime. The most important thing is to focus on what you're doing right now. As for how the process of rebirth begins, the Buddha says that it's incomprehensible. The process has been going on for a very, very, very long time, in many, many, many universes. It's so long that it's longer than this universe we're in right now, that's for sure. So, the question is not, how do things get started, but, do you want to keep on repeating the process again and again? If you want a way out, the Buddha shows you the way. And no, you can't be reborn as a rock. You can only be reborn as a living being. Question. Everything is conditioned. Everything is co-produced by dependent co-arising. Everything is a creation of the mind. Answer. Maybe not. The Buddha says all dhammas are forerun by the mind. In other words, your experience of things is based on your intentions. As for things in and of themselves out there, the Buddha doesn't talk about them. Question. Continuation of the same question. So therefore, is the self something instantaneous and ephemeral? If not, how would you explain anatta, and how should we understand the title of the book by Ajahn Chah, There is no Ajahn Chah? The notion of a person that you spoke about yesterday is not quite clear to me. Answer. The Buddha never said that there is no self. He never said that there was a self. What he did say is that the things that we hold on to through our idea of self cause us to suffer. When we hold on to our idea of self, of what we are, that causes us to suffer. So the teaching on not-self is basically a teaching on what is worth holding on to or identifying with, and what is not worth holding on to or identifying with. In the beginning of the practice, you have to hold on to the idea of yourself as responsible for doing the practice, as competent to do the practice, and that you'll benefit from the practice. Then, as your practice progresses, you'll find that there are fewer and fewer things that are worth holding on to, until you actually get to the end of the path, and then you let go of the path too. That's when you see everything as not self. When the mind gains freedom through that act of letting go, then you let go of that perception of not self as well. That's the last step to reach awakening. In that case, nibbana would be neither self nor not self. There's a book on this topic in the back of the room, Le Soi et le Pas Soi, Selves and Not Self, and I recommend that you look at it. As for the book about Ajahn Chah, at that point in time, Ajahn Chah wasn't Ajahn Chah anymore. He had let go of everything, but he was still alive. People are defined by their attachments. When there's no more attachment, then they're not defined, so you can't say anything about them. Question: when there is no person or being, why is there an illusion that there is a person or a being? It is so strong and difficult to overcome. What point of view is the best practice for seeing that there is no person? Answer: as long as there is the process of becoming, there is a person being created by this process. The practice is not so much seeing that there never was anybody. Basically, it's seeing how you are creating that person all the time, and you have to decide whether you want to keep on creating that person or not. The Buddha gives you instructions on how to stop, with the assurance that when you stop, it does not lead to annihilation. What's left is the ultimate happiness. And as Ajahn Sawat once said, once you've attained the ultimate happiness, you don't care whether there's a being there or not. Everything is satisfied. Question: as for the topic of anicca, what is the difference that you see between impermanence and inconstancy? Answer: impermanence covers things like mountains, which can be pretty stable. You know that someday the mountain will be demolished through geologic forces, but you feel, as long as I'm alive, it's not going to be demolished, so I can safely build my house there. Pali actually has another word for impermanent, adhuva. Inconstancy, anicca, is like a mountain that's subject to earthquakes all the time. Would you still want to build your house there? No, because it's too undependable. That's inconstancy. Question: when do we produce penetrative visions or insight? Is it during the meditation? Is it during another moment during the day? Do they happen during dreams? Is it an intellectual comprehension of phenomena as they are? And how do we know that this is not the fruit of our own imagination? Answer: to begin with, genuine insights don't happen during dreams. An actual insight is when you see that you're creating suffering and you don't have to. Then you can stop creating the cause. The measure of how true it is how much suffering stops. Insight is not insight into things as they are, it's insight into things as they function, and particularly how they function to cause suffering and how you can stop doing that. We're the ones creating the causes of suffering, and insight shows us, 1, that we're doing it, and 2, how we can stop. Question: what's the difference between samadhi and nimitta? Answer: the word nimitta has 2 meanings. In the commentaries, it's a vision that can occur during concentration. In the suttas, it's the theme that's the focus of your concentration, such as the body in and of itself. Samadhi is the actual solidity of your mind as you're concentrating. Meditation. This afternoon we had a question that was quite long. I'll just give you the general outlines, but I think it's of interest to everyone. The person said there was a relative who had done something that was very hard to forgive. The relative never asked for forgiveness and is now dead. The person who wrote the note said that he or she is still angry with the dead relative and tries to send thoughts of goodwill to him, but realizes that it comes only from the head and not from the heart. The solution to this is, 1, to realize what forgiveness means, and 2, to realize what goodwill means. To forgive doesn't mean that you wipe the slate clean. It means that you decide not to try to get revenge. As for goodwill, remember that goodwill is a wish for happiness, and when you extend goodwill to someone, it means basically, may this person understand the causes for true happiness and be willing and able to act on them. So if somebody's done something really bad, what you're basically hoping for is that they will see the error of their ways and make up their minds not to repeat that kind of action. You're not saying, may you be happy as you are, but may you be happy through learning how to act skillfully. As for the fact that this action has happened, remember what the Buddha said about our many lifetimes. We've been through many, many, many universes. The Buddha doesn't advocate a Big Bang theory. It's more like a bang, 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 bang theory. When the Buddha described his memory of previous lifetimes, he remarked that those who are able to remember 40 universes of lifetimes have a very short memory. So think about all the different things that we've all done to one another in those many lifetimes. Just imagine how many lifetimes you've been through in all that time. You've done many, many good things and many, many bad things. For the bad things you did in the past, I'm sure you would want to be forgiven. So try to extend this attitude toward other people for their bad actions. When you can think in these terms, it's a lot easier to let go of your anger and to actually feel goodwill. So for this last session of the afternoon, you may want to spend some time thinking goodwill for all the beings there are and giving forgiveness to yourself for all the bad things you've done, even the many things you can't remember. Lessons for illness. Tonight we'll be talking about the lessons for facing illness that can be derived from the Buddha's awakening. To continue with the story of Ven, Rathapala, and King Karavya, remember that Rathapala told the king about the 4 Dhamma summaries that inspired him to go forth as a monk. The second one was, the world is without shelter, without protector. You can imagine what the king thought about that. So Rathapala asked the king, do you have a recurrent illness? The king replied, yes, I have a wind illness, which basically means shooting pains throughout the body. He added, sometimes I'm lying in bed and my courtiers are standing around saying, maybe this time he'll die, maybe this time he'll die. So Rathapala asks him, can you command them to take part of the pain and share it among them, so that you don't have to feel all the pain yourself? The king said, no, I have to feel all the pain on my own. That's the meaning of the phrase, the world is without shelter, without protector. This is a lesson in dukkha, the stress and pain of this state of becoming, and of course, it's a lesson in illness. The canon, in its treatment of illness, takes hunger as the primary example of illness. It's something that affects all of us, and it's a paradigm for how to treat other illnesses. It comes from a lack or imbalance in the physical properties, and you treat it when you can, but you learn how to bear up with it when you can't. Ajahn Fuang tells a story about when he was with Ajahn Mun and there were occasions when a monk would be sick, but there was no medicine for his illness. If the monk was begging for medicine, Ajahn Mun would scold him. You're a meditator. Use your discernment to comprehend the pain, he would say. But when there was medicine and the monk refused to take it, Ajahn Mun would scold him. Why are you making yourself so difficult to care for? It sounds like you'd get scolded either way, but the message was this: treat the illness with medicine when medicine is available, but otherwise, use the strengths of the mind to treat it in any event. You start with the strength of conviction in the Buddha's awakening. Think of the teaching on karma, in line with the principles of this that conditionality. Some of your diseases come from past karma, some come from present karma, some come from a mixture of the two. This is why not all diseases go away when you get your mind free of defilement. Past karma is playing a role. Even the Buddha, the most spiritually advanced person who ever was, suffered from diseases every now and then because of his past karma. He classed diseases into 3 categories. 1. Those that will go away without medicine. 2. Those that won't go away even when you do take medicine. And 3. Those that will go away only when you do take medicine, but not if you don't. You can't know ahead of time which category a particular disease falls into, so you have to treat it as if it belongs to the 3rd type, which means that you treat it with medicine when you can. This is why the Vinaya, the collection of the monks' rules, is so full of medical knowledge concerning medicines and other treatments for dealing with disease. It also describes the ideal patient. A sick person endowed with 5 qualities is easy to care for. He does what is amenable to his cure. He knows the proper amount in things amenable to his cure. He takes his medicine. He tells the symptoms as they have come to be to the nurse desiring his welfare, saying that they are worsening when they are worsening, improving when they are improving, or remaining the same when they are remaining the same, and he's the type of person who can endure bodily feelings that are painful, fierce, sharp, racking, repellent, disagreeable, and life-threatening. A sick person endowed with these 5 qualities is easy to tend to. The hardest of those 5 qualities, of course, is enduring pain. This is where you have to bring in the strength of persistence. Your right attitude is that the body may be sick, but the mind will not be sick. There are 3 main points to understand here. The first point is having the right attitude toward your disease. If you ask yourself, why is this disease happening to me? The answer is, because you were born. It happens to everybody, so you have to regard it as normal and see it as an opportunity to strengthen your mind in the face of adversity. The second point is seeing the value of learning how to endure pain. You don't want your mind to be driven by fear of pain. Otherwise, people who don't wish you well can take advantage of that fear. Also, learning to endure the pain of illness helps to prepare you for the pains of death. This is where you bring in the strengths of shame and compunction. Think of the meditators in the past who have been brave in facing pain and whose minds gained important insights as a result. Both of my teachers, Ajahn Fuang and Ajahn Sawat, said that they gained important insights because of their illnesses. In Ajahn Fuang's case, it was chronic intense headaches. In Ajahn Sawat's case, it was malaria. One time Ajahn Sawat said, "If malaria were a person, I would bow down to him out of gratitude." Remember that death will be even more painful, so you want to ensure that pain will not pull down your mind state at that time, so here's your chance to practice with pain. The third main point to keep in mind is that you're not here just to endure the pain. You're here to understand the pain so that it doesn't overcome the mind. The ideal attitude is that you want to be able to experience pain disjoined from it, which means that the pain may be there, but you can see it as something separate from your body and separate from your awareness. We cling to pain not directly, but because we cling to things we like that are right around the pain. To separate the pain out from these things, we can't just sit and endure it. We have to be more proactive and experiment with it to see that it is distinct from the physical and mental events surrounding it. This is where we develop the strength of discernment by remembering the analysis of feeling given in dependent co-arising and then applying that knowledge to our specific pains. Dependent co-arising describes the factors around feeling in 2 of the early factors of the list, fabrication and name and form. Under fabrication, directed thought and evaluation are right next to feeling. Remember that directed thought and evaluation are basically how you're talking to yourself about the pain. Another subfactor under fabrication are perceptions, which are your mental images and labels of pain. Under name and form, near feeling, you also have the physical properties of the body, along with perceptions, intentions, and acts of attention. Any of these factors could be making it hard to endure pain, but if you train them properly, they can actually make it easier to endure pain. Sometimes you're told that you cannot want for the pain to go away because that's craving. That's partially true, but it has to be qualified. In order to separate the pain from its accompanying factors so that you can experience it disjoined from it, you have to see what you're doing that's aggravating the pain unnecessarily, whether physically or mentally, so that you can stop doing those things. In Majjhima 101, the Buddha says not to load yourself down unnecessarily with pain, and by definition from his point of view, all mental pain is unnecessary. So the desire not to suffer mentally from the pain is actually part of the path. If you can lessen the physical pain in the process, that's all to the good. In reference to those 2 sets of factors in dependent co-arising, you can see that breath meditation is very helpful with its emphasis on the 3 types of fabrication. It's also good for dealing with the extra factors that come from name and form, the 4 physical properties or elements, and the way in which the mind's intentions and acts of attention shape whatever the experience is. It's here that you develop the remaining strengths in dealing with the pain, in other words, mindfulness, concentration, and discernment. You may remember the 4 steps of mindfulness of breathing dealing with feeling, which we talked about yesterday morning. Breathing in and out sensitive to rapture or refreshment. Breathing in and out sensitive to pleasure. breathing in and out sensitive to mental fabrication, and breathing in and out calming mental fabrication. These steps, in the context of meditation in general, refer to the stages in getting the mind to settle into deeper and deeper stages of concentration through cultivating rapture together with feelings of pleasure and equanimity. But the teachings of the Thai forest masters show that these steps can also be applied to the contemplation of feelings of pain, including the pains of illness, as well. The first two steps, dealing with rapture and pleasure, receive a great deal of attention from Ajahn Lee. His instructions for breath meditation focus on the breath energies throughout the body that accompany the in and out breath, and he shows how these energies can be very useful in exploring what you're doing that may be contributing to physical pain. The first step he recommends, when there's a pain in the body, is not to focus attention directly on the pain, but instead to focus on a part of the body that you can make pleasurable by the way you breathe and by the way you allow the breath energies to flow freely through that area. Sometimes the best place to focus is in a part of the body immediately opposite to the pain. For example, if the pain is on the right side of the body, you focus on the corresponding spot on the left. If it's in the back, you focus in front. Or you may find that the pain in one part of the body is related to an energy blockage in another, more remote part of the body. In my own experience, I've had migraines that were alleviated when I focused on clearing up energy blockages in my lower back. Eventually, you'll want to be able to focus directly on the pain itself, but Ajahn Lee's first step in approaching pain accomplishes three things. 1. It gives you a beachhead of pleasure to which you can retreat if you find that the pain becomes overwhelming. 2. It gives the mind a solid basis in concentration, which can provide a sense of nourishment for the work of contemplating the pain. 3. It gives you practice in learning how to focus on a part of the body without tensing up that part of the body. This will be an especially useful lesson in learning how to pay direct attention to pain without aggravating it. Working with breath in this way also involves discernment, as you explore the three types of fabrication in relationship to the pain. You start with bodily fabrication, the rhythm and texture of how you breathe in and out, and you also bring in verbal fabrication, talking to yourself about how to make the breath comfortable, how to maintain that sense of comfort once it's there, and how to spread it through the parts of the body that are receptive to that good energy. This, of course, also involves mental fabrication in terms of the perceptions you use to experiment with the breath energies in different parts of the body. Ajahn Lee recommends two perceptions to help in this step in dealing with pain. Think of the body as a house with a few rotten floorboards. If you're going to sit or lie down on the floor, choose a spot where the boards aren't rotten. Or think of it as a mango with a rotten spot. Leave the rotten spot to the worms. You eat the good part remaining. Then, when the breath is solidly comfortable and the mind feels ready, drop those two images. Now think of spreading the good breath energy through the pain. For example, if there's a pain in your knee, think of the good energy going down the leg through the knee and out the tips of the toes. Don't let there be a perception of the pain blocking the breath. Remind yourself that breath is energy, and energy can go through anything. I found it helpful to think of the area of the body that's in pain as being composed of atoms, and atoms are mainly space, so the breath can penetrate easily through the space. The perception of the pain as a blockage is actually conflating the pain with the solidity or earth property of the body. As long as you cling to the body, that would be a recipe for allowing the pain to invade the mind and remain. Or, as I said earlier, you can perceive the breath as being in that part of the body prior to the pain, so that you can minimize the sense that the pain is blocking it. There are also other questions you can ask about the pain and its relationship to perception at this stage. Do you perceive the pain as being blocked off from the breath? Are you using the parts of the body that are in pain to do the breathing? If so, think of those parts relaxing and allow other parts of the body to do the work of breathing instead. You can also experiment with the perception of having the breath go straight into the pain when it first enters the body. See what that does to your experience of pain. Sometimes when you follow this step, the pain will go away or will be greatly reduced. Even if it doesn't, you will have established an important relationship vis-à-vis the pain. You can be proactive in dealing with it. You're not afraid of it. You're not a passive victim. When you're proactive, you're not a stationary target for the pain, so it can't hit you so easily. At the same time, by learning to question your perceptions around the breath and the pain, you've learned how arbitrary some of your original perceptions were. By sensitizing you to the role of perception, mental fabrication, around the pain as you try to find perceptions that help to alleviate the pain, this insight makes some beginning forays into the third and fourth steps in contemplating pain, sensitizing yourself to mental fabrications, perceptions and feelings, and then calming them. These are the steps to which Ajahn Mahabua devotes a great deal of attention. He recommends a wide range of questions that you can ask yourself about how you perceive the pain. For instance, do you perceive the pain as being the same thing as the part of the body that's in pain? If the pain is in the knee, do you see the pain in the knee as being the same thing? This question may seem strange, but remember, we may have picked up some strange ideas about pain when we were children, and often these ideas are still lurking in our subconscious. The only way to dig them out is to ask questions like this. If the pain and the part of the body seem to be one, remind yourself that your experience of the body is made up of the four properties of earth, water, wind, and fire, but the pain is something else. The pain may seem solid or hot, but remind yourself that solidity and heat are properties of the body that you've conflated with the pain. Can you perceive the pain as being separate from the solidity or the heat? To counteract the perception of the solidity of pain, you can try to perceive it as distinct moments, arising and passing away in quick succession. A related question is, does the pain have a shape? If you perceive it as having a shape, again you've glommed the pain together with a property of the body. Similarly, you can ask yourself if there are pains in several parts of the body that seem to be connected with lines of tension. This is actually another way of giving the pains a shape and of conflating the pains with the body. So ask yourself if you can see the pains as separate from one another. Or try to counteract the perception of a connection with an alternative perception. You have a knife that you can use to cut any connections as soon as they appear. Another question. Do you perceive the pain as having an intention to hurt you? Remind yourself that pain is not a conscious agent. It has no intentions at all. It's just an event that depends on other events. If you perceive it as having an intention to hurt you, you're creating a sense of self around the perception of being the target of malicious intent. When dropping the perception of its intention, you can also ask yourself why you're identifying yourself as the target. Another question. Where is the most intense point of pain? If you look carefully, you'll see that it moves around. Try chasing it down. This line of questioning not only helps to loosen up any fixed perceptions you might have around the pain, but it also gives you practice in being courageous in the face of pain. Instead of trying to run away from it, you run toward it, and it'll run away from you. This exercise also helps to guarantee that in your contemplation of pain, you haven't allowed the desire for it to go away to slip into first place in your intention for focusing on it. The correct intention toward it is to try to understand it. In addition to applying these questions and perceptions, verbal and mental fabrications, to your own pains, you also need to come up with some questions of your own around your perception of pain to see what helps you to detect perceptions you may not have noticed and to loosen them up. A question I found helpful, once you can perceive the pain as occurring in discrete moments, is to ask yourself, when the moments of pain arise, are they coming at you or going away from you? See if you can hold in mind the perception that they're going away, going away. It's like riding in a train in a seat with your back to the engine. As the train runs along the track and you look out the window, you'll notice that whatever comes into the range of your awareness in the landscape outside is already going away from you as soon as you see it. This perception helps to get rid of the perception that the pain is aimed at you. It also helps to detect and loosen up any tendency you have to cling to the perception of yourself as a target. When you loosen up and drop your perceptions around the pain may go away, sometimes in some very uncanny ways. I myself once was meditating and managed to separate the perception of the pain from the pain itself, and the pain slipped from where it originally was, ran through the body, into the heart, and disappeared. But even if the pain doesn't go away with this analysis, you'll arrive at a state of mind where you sense that the pain can still be there, but your awareness feels separate from it. The body is one thing, the pain is another, your awareness is yet another. They're in the same place, but they're separate, just like the radio waves transmitted from Marseille, Nice, and Aix going through the air all around you. They're all in the same place, but at different frequencies. If you have a radio that can distinguish the frequencies, you can tune into the various frequencies without having to move the radio to one place for one frequency and to another place for a different one. Other times when you can separate the pain from the body and from the awareness, you get the sensation that the pain actually moves itself away from the body and hovers at a slight distance from it. Ajahn Mahabua notes that a strategy for dealing with pain that works today may not work with a different pain tomorrow. And given what the Buddha teaches about the many factors surrounding pain, it's easy to see why. One day a pain may invade the mind when you conflate it with one aggregate or factor of dependent co-arising, form, say, or a particular perception, and on the next day, another pain may invade the mind when you've conflated it with another one. If you compare the Ajahn strategies with the various causal clusters described in dependent co-arising, you'll see that they deal not only with the issue of perception, under the factor of fabrication, but also with the issues of attention and intention under name in name and form. Attention determines not only where in the body you focus your interest, but also which questions you focus on asking and answering. Intention, of course, deals with your reasons for contemplating the pain. As I noted above, the quest not to have the pain invade the mind can include within it the desire to see the pain go away, but it can't allow that desire to be prominent. For your contemplation to get results, the desire to understand the pain always has to come first. When you understand these exercises in this way, it gives you an idea of the range of different questions you might try in your own investigation of pain to develop dispassion for the two reasons why pain could invade your mind and remain: what you're doing to aggravate the pain, and what you're clinging to that you've conflated with the pain. When you understand these two issues, you've gone a long way toward unraveling the problem of suffering. The important point is that you don't make physical weakness or illness an excuse for not taking a proactive approach to understanding pain. As I noted above, both Ajahn Fuang and Ajahn Suwat gained important insights into pain and into the mind, while contemplating pain while they were seriously ill. Many other people in the forest tradition, ordained and not, have also reported similar results. If they can do it, so can you. Which means that even though there's the pain of illness, you can do something about it. And in doing something about it, you've greatly strengthened your mind to deal with the even greater challenges facing it at the end of life. Mindfulness of breathing, mental qualities, Part 1. This morning we'll begin our discussion of the fourth tetrad in the Buddhist teachings on mindfulness of breathing, the 4 steps dealing with mental qualities, or dhammas. Some people have asked, what's the difference between this tetrad and the third, which deals with the mind as its frame of reference? There are 2 ways of answering that question. The first has to do with the image of the committee of the mind. If you see the mind as having lots of voices, with lots of different opinions, you might think of mind as a frame of reference concerned with the mind as a whole, the times when the committee has come to an agreement, whereas mental qualities refer to the individual members of the committee. In particular, when you're focusing on this tetrad, your purpose is to get rid of specific members that obstruct mindfulness and concentration, and to encourage members that help the mind to settle down. This connects directly with the second way of answering the question. Remember the Buddha's basic formula for establishing mindfulness: keeping focused on the body in and of itself, ardent, alert, and mindful, putting aside greed and distress with reference to the world. This formula describes 2 activities: keeping focused on the topic of your concentration, and putting aside any thoughts related to the world that would pull you away from that focus. The first 3 tetrads, for the most part, are concerned with the first activity, maintaining focus, keeping the breath, the comfortable feelings associated with the breath, and your awareness of the breath altogether, filling your sense of the body. The fourth tetrad is more concerned with the second activity, putting aside thoughts related to the world. In this way, it connects directly with the last step in the third tetrad. If you remember, that step is to breathe in and out, releasing the mind. This fourth tetrad goes into the details of how to go about releasing the mind, first from any concerns about the world that would destroy the focus of your concentration, and then ultimately from any thoughts around the world of your concentration itself. In this way, the fourth tetrad first guards your concentration and then guards your mind from getting stuck on concentration or even stuck on discernment, That's how it brings total release. The steps in the fourth tetrad are these. First, as you breathe in and out, you focus on inconstancy, anicca, which would also include dukkha and anatta, stress and not self. Second, you breathe in and out focusing on dispassion. Third, you breathe in and out focusing on cessation. And fourth, you breathe in and out focusing on letting go. There's a lot to say about these steps, so this morning we'll discuss the first two and save the last two for tomorrow. So, step 1. Focusing on inconstancy. The Pali term here, anicca, is often translated as impermanent, but that's not quite accurate. Anicca is the opposite of nicca, which means constant, as in an activity that constantly takes place or reliably happens. It's possible to know that something is impermanent, like, say, the Alps, but to feel confident that they're reliable enough so that you can visit them without too much fear that they will fall on you. But when you see that a mountain is constantly subject to earthquakes, you might decide that it's too dangerous to visit. So when you're focusing on inconstancy, you're trying to see how you can't really rely on the things where you usually look to find your happiness. And it's important that you understand this focus. To see how things in general, such as the breath, are changing all the time, doesn't have much of an impact on the mind. It's like seeing houses sliding down a hill. As long as they're not your houses, you may feel sympathy for the people who live in those houses, but it's easy to accept that this is part of life. Things are sliding down hills all the time. But if your own house slides down a hill, it has a much deeper impact on your mind. In the same way, when you're focusing on inconstancy in a way that gives rise in a meaningful way to the next step, focusing on dispassion, you have to be investigating places that mean a lot to you, where you've looked for happiness in the past. Only then will this reflection have an impact on the mind. In following the first two steps, it's not the case that you can go straight from focusing on anicca to focusing on dispassion. In other words, you can't simply say to yourself, gee, this body of mine is inconstant. It changes, so I'm just going to abandon attachment to it. That doesn't work. It's like saying, food is unreliable. Every time I eat, I get hungry again, so I might as well just stop eating. If you did that, you wouldn't last very long. You'd either starve to death or start eating again. There are actually extra steps in between to answer the argument. Okay, this may be inconstant, but why should I let it go? This is where we have to look elsewhere in the canon to see what those extra steps might be. And we find passages where the Buddha describes 5 steps in the process. First, you look for origination. In other words, when anger, say, arises, you look to see what's causing it. Now, the word origination has 2 aspects that make it different from simple arising. The first aspect is that you're looking to see what's causing the appearance of whatever it is. In other words, you're not just watching things appear, you're looking to see what's making them appear. And second, when the Buddha talks about origination, almost invariably he's talking about causes coming from within your own mind. So you look to see, what's the mind doing that's causing this to arise? The second step is to watch that mind state passing away. Here the question is, what's the mind doing when it passes away? What changed in my mind? Then watch out to see if the mind picks the anger up again. These first 2 steps counteract a common impression that a particular instance of desire or anger that has come into the mind is there 24/7 when it's actually not. It comes and it goes, but then you pick it up again. The picking it up again, that's the problem. You can see this clearly with anger. When anger flares up in the mind, it has a physical component. Your breath changes and hormones are released into the blood. The mind, however, can sustain a thought of anger for only a brief while, and then it fades. Yet the hormones are still in the blood, speeding up your heart rate, affecting your breath, and creating tension in your chest, your stomach, or your hands. You notice that, and you read it as a sign that you're still angry, so you pick the anger up again. It seems natural, but if you don't want to be a slave to your anger, you have to question that tendency. You don't really have to pick it up again. You could simply let the hormones run their course and then fade away. So why do you want to pick the anger up again? What's the allure? That's the third step. After you've been looking for the origination and the passing away, you look for the allure. What's the attraction of that mind state? What makes you feel you want to go with it or should go with it? Often you find that even though there are aspects of anger that you don't really like, there is a part of the mind that likes anger. It may feel that anger liberates you from some social constraints, so that you can speak and act as you like without caring about the consequences. Or there are times when you somehow feel obligated to be loyal to your anger. You might feel that if you dropped the anger, you'd be admitting that you were a coward, or that you were wrong to be angry in the first place. Or you might feel that you should remain true to your feelings in general. Whatever the allure, you have to look carefully for it and admit it to yourself when you see it in action. Sometimes it's hard to admit to yourself that you like your defilements, but this is where honesty is important. Otherwise, if you don't understand the appeal of a particular defilement, you'll never get past it. Then in the fourth step, you observe the drawbacks of that defilement. If I follow through with this, what are the drawbacks going to be? If I keep putting energy into maintaining this feeling, how am I going to act? And even if I don't act on it, what is it going to do to my mind if I'm constantly going back to this particular type of greed, aversion, delusion? The Buddha says you're bending the mind in the direction of those defilements. Nowadays, we'd say you're putting ruts in the mind. As soon as you get near that issue again, you just go right into the rut and get carried away wherever the rut will lead you. Another way of looking at the drawbacks of that defilement is to see that whatever satisfaction or benefit it may give you is inconstant, stressful, and not self. It requires a lot of energy to keep the defilement going, but then the results don't give any real lasting satisfaction. Once you're clear about the drawbacks, then you can compare them with the allure. When you can see, I'm putting all this effort and energy into this, and I'm not getting the payback that I want. I'm creating stress and suffering but getting no real satisfaction to compensate for the amount of energy I'm putting into it. That's when you arrive at a value judgment. This isn't worth the energy that goes into fabricating it. With that judgment, you develop dispassion for the act of fabricating it any further. You let it go. It's like seeing that you're making an investment that's actually costing more than it repays, so you withdraw your funds. Or you can compare it to a game you used to play as a child. When you see no more challenge or interest in playing the game, you outgrow it. As the Thai Ajahns say, you sober up. When you can say, I've had enough of this, that's dispassion, which is the escape from that mind state. So that's how you go from contemplating inconstancy to contemplating dispassion, the fifth step in this five-step process, and the second step in the fourth tetrad of breath meditation. You train yourself to breathe in and out focused on dispassion. We'll continue with the remaining two steps in this tetrad tomorrow morning. Question: why do we meditate? Answer: ideally, we should be meditating because we realize that we're causing unnecessary suffering and we would like to stop. Question: when one is face to face with a person who is suffering and is not on the spiritual path, how can one help them? With reference to all that you've said and taught us about pain, what can one say to that person? How can one aid that person simply? Answer: what we were talking about yesterday were techniques for someone who believes that it is useful to learn how to endure pain but not suffer from it. So, whatever that person's background of beliefs, you try to use that background to help motivate him or her to see that, yes, it is useful to learn how to endure pain without suffering from it. Question: is it possible that a person might be convinced or grasped subconsciously that his or her pain is deserved from past bad karma and that nothing can aid that person? Answer: you have to convince the person that what we experience is not just the result of past karma. What we're doing right now in the present moment also plays a role in how we experience the present moment. Think for a moment about the Buddha. Before teaching people how to put an end to suffering, did he ask them, do you deserve to suffer? He never asked that question. He said, in effect, if you're suffering, this is how you can put an end to it. Also, he never talked about people deserving to suffer. He did say that certain actions in the past will tend to lead to certain results, but he was basically interested in convincing people that, yes, they do have within their power not to suffer no matter what they've done in the past. Question: all the instructions you've given on pain are very rich, but with all these methods and all these strategies, these questions present themselves to me. The first question is, where do you start? And are there strategies adapted to certain types of pain? Is it necessary that you try by chance to see what works? What to do? Answer. The first thing to do is remember Ajahn Lee's first step. When there's pain, don't focus directly on the pain. Focus on another part of the body and get that as comfortable as you can. Step DWP. Once there's a sense of ease in this comfortable part of the body, think of it spreading through the pain, out in the other direction, and then out the body. After that, that's when you can go to step 3, focus directly on the pain and ask questions about it. As for the questions you ask, it's hard to tell ahead of time which ones will get the best results. So that's where you have to experiment and test things. Question. I have a permanent muscular pain in the upper part of my back. When I visualize the breath, the pain amplifies with the in-breath. I've tried to adjust the length of the breath to reduce the pain, but my mind really prefers long in and out breaths. To counteract this pain, I lead my mind to a part that's numb to the pain, but after a moment, the mind keeps going back to the pain. What do I do to neutralize this perturbation so that I can give all of my energy to the meditation? Answer. You've got to train your mind to stay where you want it to stay. This is one of those points where you use the perception of not self. The upper part of my back is not mine. If the pain wants to have that, it can have it. I'm going to stay in another part of the body that's not in pain. When you can get your mind to stay focused that way and develop a good foundation in another part of the body, then you can deliberately return to the pain and start asking questions as we recommended yesterday, using whatever perceptions you can to remind yourself that the pain is one thing, but the back and the breath are something else. If all you can think is, I want the pain to go away, I want the pain to go away, that's going to get in the way of actually getting past it. Also, to make sure the pain doesn't restrict the breath, try using the perception that the breath is there prior to the pain, so it doesn't have to work around the pain, it's already there. If you can hold to that perception, it can make it more possible to breathe in a way that you like regardless of whether the pain stays or not. Question. Would it be useful to have a desire for the next life, for example, that you would like to become a monk or to become a great benefactor? Answer. The best desire for your next life, if you're going to have to be reborn, is, may I come back to a place where I can practice the Dhamma. If you place too many stipulations on where and why and how you want to be reborn, they might get in the way of that more important goal. For instance, suppose you were back in the 19th century and you were going to be born in Thailand. It turns out that, at that time, the upper strata of society were convinced of wrong view, believing that the way to Nibbana was closed and even the way to jhana was closed. You might have been tempted to tell yourself, I'd like to be born in the high level of society so that I can have power to do good. But if that aspiration came true, you'd be raised in an environment filled with wrong view. On the other hand, if you had been born as a peasant in northeastern Thailand, you would have had a better chance to practice the Dhamma. Question. You told us that it's not really useful to know your past lives, but if someone has had a difficult life, seeing that this was due to a previous life where he misbehaved, could this possibly incite that person to change his behavior and to become more kind? Answer. It is possible that it would be beneficial, but at the same time, if you know the general principle that your current life status depends a lot on your past actions, then you can just accept that as a general principle without having to know all the details. I know a monk who used to be full of himself. In other words, he had a very high opinion of himself, he followed his whims, and was unwilling to listen to others. Then one time he was staying alone in the forest. He was having his meal when something grabbed him by the back of the neck, pulled his head up, and said, "Look." It was as if, on the wall in front of him, a movie started to show. And basically, the message was, this is what you did in your previous lifetimes. He saw that he'd done a lot of really bad things. He ran out of the hut and threw up. After that, he became a changed person. So if you're very full of yourself, maybe you could use something like that. Question. Dear Ajahn, I thought I was joining a retreat that was silent. Maybe I was wrong. The group here brings me a lot of support most of the time. What to do when sometimes I feel a twinge of annoyance that just passes through? Answer. It's good to write a note like this every now and then so that I can remind everybody, please be quiet. Silence is so hard to come by and it's so easy to break. The Buddha said that one of the conditions for the maintaining of the Dhamma is that you have respect for concentration, which means respecting both your concentration and the concentration of others. At the same time, though, if there are people who are breaking silence, think of your mind as being like a screen on a window. The wind can go through the screen because the screen doesn't catch the wind. In other words, don't catch the sounds, and have lots of goodwill for everybody. Question. Through my experience with my grandparents and parents, it seems that in old age, the boredom, the inactivity, the solitude, and the emptiness of the days that pass by happen more than any really horrible pains. How do we apply the Buddhist teachings when the societal structures of the Buddhist time do not exist today? Answer. The practice here basically depends on conviction. If you're convinced that life doesn't end with death and that there is more that follows after it, then whether the social structures support you or not, you can decide to give your energy to things that will be useful as you get older. So if you believe that there's good still to be done, think about that teaching of Ajahn Mahabhao. Answer, that you squeeze as much goodness out of your body as you can before you have to throw it away. Even though society may not have much use for you when you get old, you can still get a lot of use out of your own life. Even when you're alone, you can meditate on your breath to strengthen your mind and spread thoughts of goodwill, and that's a positive contribution to the world. Question. Concerning the 4 forms of clinging, for sensual pleasures, for habits and practices, for views, and for doctrines of self, certain teachers say that they all come down to one form or another of identity, in other words, the idea of me, mine, identification. Is this the case? Answer. Every clinging involves a sense of me. However, there is a problem when people think, why don't I just go to the root of clinging and bypass dealing with all of those other forms of clinging? I don't want to bother getting rid of sensual attachments because I can just get rid of my sense of self first. But the mind doesn't work that way. You have to work with sensual desire first because otherwise it'll undermine your efforts to get rid of more subtle forms of clinging. Question. I understand that I fabricate my feelings and my perceptions. However, I do not have the impression that I fabricate my thoughts that just arrive in grand number. Where do they come from? Answer. They come from your past karma. Answer. Past actions you've done, past habits you've had, all kinds of things related to your past actions. Thoughts that seem to come out of nowhere actually come from your past karma. Question. In the committee of my breath, there are many members sitting in, but not many are in charge. The mind is the arbitrator for the long term. Can a person be defined by all the different sub-selves that he has, or can he be defined by one self that ends up dominating the others? If so, what is that called? Can one call that the tendency of a person? Answer. The Buddha never wanted us to define what we are. He basically said just to look at what you're doing. Now, if you do have a sense that there are many different members of the committee in your mind, try first to identify with the ones that are most skillful and put the other members out to pasture. The image is that you have some horses that you can't use anymore, so you just put them out in a meadow where you don't have to feed them. You find that you pare down the members of the committee more and more and more until you don't need anybody in the committee. That's when you're done. The different senses of self just don't play a role anymore. Question. My friends ask me why it matters which being I will reincarnate as, because it, she, or he will not remember that it, she, or he was me in the former life. Indeed, I have no memories of my former lives. Maybe they were much better, but I do not suffer from it as I do not know. This system sounds like you work really hard all your life for someone else to get the results from all your good actions. What should I tell them? P.S. Personally, I meditate and practice virtue for the benefits it brings me in this very life. Answer. Are you the same person that you were when you were a child? Yes and no. However, many things that you did when you were a child, like going to school, are definitely benefiting you now. At the time you were a child, you felt that, I am me. Now you feel, I am me, even though you now look and act and think like a very different person. The same sort of principle applies whether it's in the same lifetime or going over to another lifetime. You will still feel like you don't feel like you're somebody else. So it's not as if you're doing good for somebody else, you're doing it for what you become. If you're practicing for the good that it leads you to do in this lifetime, all well and good. But also be prepared for the fact that it will actually carry over to what you become in the next lifetime around. Question. Questions about inconstancy and impermanence. First question. Could inconstancy be defined as impermanence over a short time? Answer. Inconstancy is the fact that things are simply unreliable and they could change at any time. Question. Second question. Does inconstancy characterize one particular lifetime, whereas impermanence is applied to the succession of our rebirths? Answer. We use the word inconstancy because it keeps reminding us that what we have as a basis for happiness is unreliable. The Buddha asks you to take his concepts and use them for the purpose for which they are meant. That way you get the most use out of them. Here the purpose is to develop a sense of dispassion for the activities you've been doing that are causing suffering. Question. In the course of the meditations during this retreat, I've seen myself return to my childhood or other times in my life, my adolescence, etc. Is this a habit that is awaiting me at the moment when I leave this body, and should I cultivate it and let it appear at that time? Answer. This is very common when people begin a retreat. When there's less happening in the present moment, things from the past tend to well up in the mind. You have to learn how to have the right attitude towards such things, because it is true that at the end of life, events in this lifetime will often start appearing to you. It's good to prepare yourself and say, this was just in the past, and I don't have to try to go back to the past. Otherwise, you get attached there, and that will lead you to be reborn in a similar place, which is not necessarily a good thing. If it's a good memory, that place or the people involved may not be so good anymore, so don't dwell on those thoughts. If it's a bad memory, learn how to have lots of goodwill for everybody who was involved, so that you're not born under the influence of thoughts of regret or revenge. Question. Can one in Theravada Buddhism believe in something that is transcendent, that works in invisible realms to provoke events in our life, that has as its purpose to make us progress spiritually, something that is more grand than that, to which one can attain or submit oneself with confidence? The will and their efforts, don't they have their limits? Is there not another aspect of devotion in this tradition? Answer. Well, there is an aspect of devotion. We feel devotion for the Buddha for having shown us the way, for the Dhamma he taught, and for the Sangha who have kept the Dhamma alive. But the main emphasis of the Dhamma is that you do have the possibility within you that you can put an end to suffering, so learn how to have more confidence in your own efforts. Also, it is true that within the tradition that they talk about the help that sometimes comes from devas. There may be some devas who were your relatives in a past lifetime who are concerned about you, and there are cases where they can really help you. And then there are the ajans who are believed to be non-returners who can also help you. I know in my own life, as soon as I got to Thailand, it seemed as if events were arranged so that eventually I went to meet Ajahn Phuong. It almost felt preordained. However, you have to remember that devas are not totally dependable. Some are not really wise, and even the wise ones can be a little fickle. There's a story in the canon of a monk going down to bathe in a pool of water. There's a lotus in the water, so he leans over to smell the lotus. Immediately a deva appears and says, "That's an offense." The monk says, "Oh, come on, it's a minor thing." And the deva says, "If you're really serious about the practice, even minor things are very large." So he comes to his senses and says, "Well, thank you very much." And he adds, "If you ever see me do anything like this again, please let me know." The deva responds, "Look, I'm not your servant. Look after yourself." She then disappears. Question. When I think about practicing metta, goodwill, and compassion, I have fewer thoughts. But isn't this the tree that hides the forest? Aren't the thoughts just being suppressed? How to skillfully use goodwill? Answer. When you're developing thoughts of goodwill, there are many, many ways of using them. At the same time, when you're trying to get the mind into concentration, the first order of business is simply to get thoughts out of the way so that the mind can develop the solidity it needs to eventually deal wisely with its thoughts. There will come a time when you'll want to look into those thoughts to see what defilements lie behind them. But in the meantime, as you're trying to get the mind to calm down, whatever works to get thoughts out of the way is a necessary part of the practice so that the mind can become solid enough to deal skillfully with its defilements and not get pushed around by them. As for using thoughts of goodwill, there are many, many ways of using them. Just basically remember what goodwill means. May all beings understand the causes for true happiness and be willing and able to act on them. In any circumstances where you find that's a useful thought, go ahead and use it. There was a question about visions that one of you had during meditation. The question to ask yourself about visions is always, can I get a Dhamma lesson out of this vision? If there is such a lesson, then you take it and test it to see if it's reliable. After all, not everything that appears in the quiet mind can be trusted. If, however, it's not the kind of message that you can test, as when it's about something outside of you, then just let it go. Or if there doesn't seem to be any practical lesson, let the whole thing go. A second question concerned praying for others, asking, if you pray for others, does it have an impact on them? And if so, how does this fit in with the doctrine of karma? In Buddhism, we don't talk about praying, but we do send thoughts of goodwill, which is basically having a good wish for that other person. When the mind has a thought, it's actually sending out currents of energy, and sometimes a current of energy can have an impact on other people, especially if you have karma with that person, and if that person's karma is such that, at that moment, he or she can receive a good influence from outside. As for your CAM answer, it's like having a radio station. The more concentrated your mind, the stronger the signal you're sending out. And as for the people receiving it, if their radio is turned off, they can't receive anything. If it's turned on but tuned to another station, then they're not going to get it either. But if your karma is in alignment so that actually you're sending out a good signal and they're in a position to receive it, it'll have an impact, particularly on the state of their mind.